As the name indicated, it is the passive movement of substances that does not require energy. Or we could say, passive transport is the transport of substances along the concentration gradient or electrical gradient, or both electrochemical gradients. But what is this electrical gradient? What does this mean? The electrical gradient, or the electrochemical gradient, refers to the electrical potential that acts on an ion to drive the movement of the ion in one or another direction. It is caused by a charge difference across the lipid membrane. Second, a chemical component is caused by a differential concentration of ions across the membrane that we will discuss later. Coming back to passive transport. It is also known as diffusion or downhill movement. It does not need energy. Passive transport is like swimming in the direction of water flow in a river. Here, the substances move from the region of higher concentration to the region of lower concentration. Diffusion is of two types, namely simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. Simple diffusion of substances occurs either through the lipid layer or protein layer of the cell membrane. Facilitated diffusion occurs with the help of the carrier proteins of the cell membrane. Thus, the diffusion can be discussed as two types of simple diffusion that occur through the lipid and protein layer, and the facilitated diffusion that takes place with the help of carrier protein. Let's look at the two types of simple diffusion first. Simple diffusion through the lipid layer. The lipid layer of the cell membrane is permeable only to lipid-soluble substances like oxygen, carbon dioxide, and alcohol. The diffusion through the lipid layer is directly proportional to the solubility of the substances in lipids. Simple diffusion through protein layer. Protein layer of the cell membrane is permeable to water-soluble substances. Mainly, electrolytes diffuse through the protein layer. This type of diffusion takes place with the help of specified channels present throughout the membrane. Protein channels or ion channels. Throughout the central lipid layer of the cell membrane, there are some pores. These pores are made up of the integral protein molecules of the protein layer, which invaginate into these pores. These pores form the channels for the diffusion of water, electrolytes, and other substances, which cannot pass through the lipid layer. As the channels are lined by protein molecules, these are called protein channels for water-soluble substances. There are different types of protein channels. Let's look at them one by one. A characteristic feature of the protein channels, selective permeability. That is, each channel can permit only one type of ion to pass through it. Accordingly, the channels are named after the ions which diffuse through these channels, such as sodium channels, potassium channels, etc. The influx or the efflux of these ions needs to be regulated in order to maintain the balanced environment within the cell. The channels are regulated as some of the channels are continuously open while others are gated. Continuously open channels are also called as ungated channels, as opposed to closed channels are called gated channels. These channels are opened only when required. Gated channels are divided into three categories. Voltage-gated channels are the channels that open whenever there is a change in the electrical potential. Ligand-gated channels are the type of channels that open in the presence of some hormonal substances. The hormonal substances are called ligands, and the channels are called ligand-gated channels. Mechanically gated channels are the channels that are opened by some mechanical factors, such as pressure or air. To understand them better, let's look at some examples. The best example of the voltage-gated channels is in a neuromuscular junction. If we talk about the voltage-gated channels in the neuromuscular junction, when an action potential reaches the axon terminal, the calcium channels are opened, and calcium ions diffuse into the interior of the axon terminal from the extracellular fluid. In the case of the ligand-gated channels, during the transmission of impulse through the neuromuscular junction, acetylcholine is released from the vesicles. The acetylcholine moves through the membrane of the axon terminal and reaches the synaptic cleft. Then the acetylcholine molecules cause another opening of sodium channels in the postsynaptic membrane, and sodium ions to diffuse into the neuromuscular junction from the extracellular fluid. Now that we have talked about the two gated channels, let's move on to the third, mechanically gated channels. These are the channels present in the pressure receptors, such as the Pacinian corpuscles and receptor cells of other organs of Corti and vestibular apparatus. When a Pacinian corpuscle is subjected to pressure, it is compressed, resulting in the deformation of its core fiber. This deformation causes the opening of the sodium channel and the development of receptor potential. Similarly, sound waves cause the movement of cilia of hair cells in the organ of Corti, which is the receptor organ in the ear. Movements of the cilia cause the opening of potassium channels, leading to the development of receptor potential. Now we will move on towards the facilitated or carrier-mediated diffusion. Facilitated or carrier-mediated diffusion is the type of diffusion by which the water-soluble substances having larger molecules are transported through the cell membrane with the help of a carrier protein. You may be thinking, what are carrier proteins? A carrier or transport protein helps in the movement of substances within an organism, in this case a cell. You can say that it facilitates the movement of large substances into the cell. Facilitated diffusion is faster than simple diffusion, thus nutrients and essential substances are transported rapidly to a cell through this type of transport. Glucose and amino acids are two major examples that are transported by facilitated diffusion. That is because glucose or amino acid molecules cannot diffuse through the other channels because the diameter of these molecules is larger than the diameter of the channels. How is a glucose molecule transported? Glucose molecules bind with a carrier protein. After undergoing some conformational changes, the carrier protein transports the molecule to the other side of the cell membrane. Due to this change, the molecule reaches the other side of the cell membrane. That is all about the passive transport mechanism through which a cell obtains essential nutrients and other substances. A quick overview. Passive transport is of two types: simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. Simple diffusion is simply the movement of small molecules across the cell membrane. It can occur along the concentration gradient through the lipid layer, or through the protein layer of the cell membrane through protein or ion channels. These channels can be gated or non-gated. The gated channels are voltage-gated, ligand-gated, and mechanical-gated. The facilitated or the carrier-mediated transport mechanism is reserved for larger molecules that cannot pass through an ion channel. The molecule binds with a carrier protein and diffuses through the cell membrane after going through some configurational changes.